Welcome to ICEF Monitor. I'm here with Tony Edson, former Deputy Assistant Secretary of State and also a consultant for ERC. Can you tell me a little bit about your background?
Good morning. Thanks for having me. I was a consular officer, a visa officer with the U.S. Department of State for 28 years. Processed visas, a lot of student visas and other visa categories around the world, mostly in Asia. I have been retired now from that for 4 years and have been working as a consultant in border security immigration matters, and including with ERC, as you mentioned.
Let's look at it from the visa interview from your perspective. It's kind of this black box. We never know what is important in the visa interview. Can you elaborate a little bit more about this?
Sure. For students, theoretically, technically, it's a fairly straightforward analysis that the consular officer is doing. He's got to be concerned that the student's a bona fide student. He's got to be concerned that the student has a residence abroad that they intend to return to after their study in the U.S. The student needs to show that they have adequate funds to pay for the first year of school, and then if English is required, and it isn't always, but if English is required, then the student needs to be able to show that they have adequate English language skills.
And the officer is learning all that in their training, in their initial training. Can we talk a little bit about this? How long is the training? What qualifications do you need?
Sure. The initial training for consular officers is both legal and practical and takes about 7.5 weeks. They then receive training on the ground when they arrive at their assignment, because obviously conditions are different in each of these countries. Patterns of application are different, the sorts of schools that appeal to students in different countries, sorts of majors that appeal to different students. So they do that training on the job continually, and then every couple of years there's refresher training. One sort of important thing I think to keep in mind here is that because of the large number of visa applicants that are handled in the U.S. system, most officers who enter the Foreign Service, most U.S. diplomats, will be conducting visa interviews for the first 2 to 4 years of their career. Most of those officers are not consular officers. They will not spend the rest of their career doing that. They'll move on to some other specialty. So that means that you're getting, hardworking, dedicated, trained officers, but in many cases these are not people who've done this for an extended period of time, and that's just something to keep in mind.
What are the reasons behind that? Why is the state doing that?
Mostly because under U.S. law, in-person interviews are required for nearly all visa applicants, and there just is no way to staff up the interviewing function, the consular function, adequately unless you use all officers. Otherwise, you'd have too many people at the senior levels who had visa experience, and we don't need that, later on. In general, if a student is turned down for a student visa, it'll be tied to a couple of things. That issue of temporariness that we talked about briefly, the question of, is the student actually planning on going home again when they're done studying? That comes up a lot. It matters more in some countries than others, obviously. I mean, there are countries now where there's a lot of civil unrest, perhaps economic hardship, and there's a real incentive for the student perhaps to stay on in the United States. Another factor that weighs into that would be the finances. If the student is having a difficulty paying for the education, or if they paid for the education by pooling resources from an extended family, and the consular officer is concerned perhaps that the student can't afford to go home because they would never be able to pay their family back for all the money that was borrowed to send them to school in the United States, then that suggests that maybe it's not a temporary stay in the U.S. Other factors have to do with, remember I mentioned at the beginning that U.S. law requires the student be a bona fide student. Consular officers have a lot of discretion to try to figure out what a bona fide student is. So if the student has a record of poor academic performance, or perhaps they have their English is not as good as the TOEFL score would indicate their English should be, if the student is vague about what they want to study in the United States or why they chose to do that, why they chose the school they're going to, all those things can lead a consular officer to be concerned that the student that studying in the U.S. may not be their primary purpose in going to the United States. Perhaps they're just looking for a quick way to immigrate. It's a tough call. It's a very subjective call, and I think consular officers are the first ones to admit that they get it wrong sometimes. on both directions, on both sides. They issue visas to people who don't deserve them, and they turn down visas to people who do deserve them. When This is a long answer, but you suggested a few things to me with your question. When students are turned down, a common complaint is that they are not given clear guidance on why they were denied the visa, on what was wrong with their application. Um, there are a couple of reasons behind that. The consular officer will give them a legal citation. They'll cite the section of U.S. law that applies. That's not going to be very helpful in most cases, but that's the minimum that'll be done. In terms of specific details, I think a lot of consular officers are concerned that if they go into a great deal of detail, what's going to happen is this student will then prepare a rebuttal in a great deal of detail. And if the issue at heart was one of credibility, the consular officer just didn't believe they were planning to study temporarily in the States and then go home. If that's the issue, then having the student come back with additional documents is sort of wasting their time and application money. And so there's a concern that you not draw the student into a vicious loop where they just keep reapplying and keep getting turned down. At the same time, if the student believes that if they believe that they genuinely qualify for the visa, and they're the one that'll know that, right? I mean, they'll know if they really intended to go study seriously in the U.S. and then go home. Then by all means, they should feel free to apply again, because there isn't a formal appeal process in the U.S. visa system, but there is an unlimited ability to reapply for a visa again. And if they are qualified, hopefully then they can establish that to the satisfaction of the consular officer and get that visa and study.
That's very interesting and brings me to my next question. Is there anything like a guideline or for agents, or how can agents help their students if they apply?
Mm-hmm. I think agents actually can very much help their students when they apply. There are a couple of things to keep in mind. When the student goes in most societies, we know that foreign student dealing with a foreign government, the non-U.S. citizen student dealing with a foreign government, U.S. government official, that can be an intimidating interaction. The U.S. government official may be speaking their language in a less than expert way. The student may be uncomfortable in English, so you've got some language issues going on. In the consular waiting room, the physical setup where the interviews are conducted, the interview will be conducted through a ballistic glass barrier, microphones. We've experimented over the years with a whole wide variety of microphones, and none of them work very well. The acoustics are pretty poor. So you've got languages, you've got that nervousness. If the student is looking down, then that makes it even harder to communicate because there's no eye contact and because they're mumbling down. I think it's useful for agents to prepare students in advance to that sort of interaction. Let them know that that's the environment. It'll be a little noisy. It'll be hard to hear. Students should feel free to ask the consular officer to repeat the question. Ask them to repeat it in another language. If, for example, the consular officer asked in their language first, maybe they can ask them to repeat it in English. That's a big thing. Tell them not to be too nervous and make as much eye contact as they can. Students shouldn't rehearse their answers, but I think that they should definitely think in advance about certain key questions. Why did they choose this school? How many schools did they apply to, and why did they choose to apply to the schools they applied to as a group? Why did they choose the particular major? What do they intend to do with the major? And then how are they going to pay for it? Where's the money coming from? And this one is, again, culturally and practically a hard question to answer in some societies, but it's not very helpful for the consular officer if the answer is my father's paying for it, and they don't really know. If that's the answer, then they need to know what the father's business is and how the investment will be recouped in the end. It's a lot of money to be spent on a U.S. education, and the consular officer wants to have a sense that there's a rational economic plan here that the student and his family have thought through.
Excellent. Now we were talking a lot about the single students, but now let's look into groups, because sometimes there's like band camps or groups going to a soccer camp or whatever. How's the visa interview done with them?
Unlike other there are some visa categories, for example, musicians, where there is a group petition that's involved, and so the group sort of naturally holds together. With students, their applications are all individual applications, and the tracking system in the United States through SEVIS, the online automated tracking system, tracks them as individuals. So there's no natural way for the groups to be associated with each other in terms of the case management and the automated systems. That makes it really important for the agent and the sponsoring institution to work with, at the very least, to work with each other to prepare a cover letter for the student group, preferably to try to contact the consular section where the students will be applying in order to ensure that they're expecting the group to apply. I think what you're raising is a very good point, because a group going together will generally have an easier time with visa processing if the consular section knows to expect a group like that and has an idea of the boundaries of the group and their activities.
So in a group, it could be that parts of the groups or parts of the students are turned down, and other ones, other students are allowed.
Correct, and that's particularly, it can happen. It can happen for a number of reasons, but it is particularly prone to happen if the students come in separately without having forewarned the consular section that a group is involved.
Thank you for bringing some light into the process of visa interviews, Tony Edson, and lovely to have you here.
Okay, thank you very much.